California, the Golden State, the place where dreams come to life, where tech billionaires are minted overnight, where the weather is perfect and the future always feels like it's right around the corner. That's what they told you. That's the brand. But here's what's actually happening right now. People are fleeing California at a rate that hasn't been seen in the state's entire history. Not a slowdown, not a correction. A full-scale exit. For 6 straight years, California has ranked dead last on U-Haul's National Migration Index. 6 consecutive years of more people loading trucks and leaving than arriving. In 2025 alone, the state recorded a net loss of roughly 216,000 residents. And the ones leaving aren't random. They're younger. They're wealthier. They're more educated. The Internal Revenue Service tracked $24 billion in taxpayer income lost to outbound migration in a single year. That's $24 billion walking out the door. Since 2011, California has shed over $102 billion in net adjusted gross income to domestic emigration. $102 billion. Gone. So before anyone tells you California is fine, let's talk about what's really going on. Start with the streets. Walk through downtown San Francisco on a Tuesday afternoon, and what you'll find isn't the tech capital of the world. You'll find emptiness. 1 out of every 3 office buildings in that city is sitting vacant right now. 1/3. Before the pandemic, San Francisco's office vacancy rate hit a historic low of 4.7%. Today, it hovers around 30%, and even after years of AI companies flooding in, even after a so-called gold rush for commercial real estate, even after OpenAI leasing nearly 1 million square feet across the city, the vacancy rate has barely budged from its peak of nearly 37%. That's not recovery. That's a city with a gaping structural wound that AI is barely covering with a bandage. And it's not just offices. The Van Ness corridor in San Francisco is sitting at a 53% retail vacancy rate. 53%. More than half the storefronts on that street are dark. Between 2020 and 2023, nearly 40 retail stores closed around Union Square alone, one of the most famous shopping destinations in America. The city has gotten so desperate that officials are now letting commercial landlords convert empty retail spaces into gyms, tenant lounges, and co-working areas just to keep the lights on. That is not a comeback story. That's triage. Now, before you say, but the population is growing again, let's be real about what that actually means. Yes, technically California's population ticked upward in recent years, but here's what's underneath that number. Domestic residents are leaving in the hundreds of thousands, and that gap is being papered over almost entirely by international immigration. In the year ending July 2025, net international migration brought in roughly 126,000 people. Without those arrivals, California's population would be actively shrinking, which means the state's long-term growth engine isn't innovation or opportunity anymore, it's immigration. And under the current federal administration, that pipeline has been dramatically restricted. Strip away international arrivals, and the state's demographic math collapses. The Legislative Analyst's Office put it plainly, California without foreign immigration faces a population decline. That's the actual condition of the most populated state in the country. And who exactly is leaving? This is where it gets uncomfortable. The people exiting California are not random. They skew younger, higher income, and more educated than those staying behind or arriving from abroad. IRS migration data shows California was the single largest income loser in the country. Not second, not close, the largest. High-income Californians are heading almost exclusively to states with no income tax. Florida, Texas, Nevada, Tennessee. Oracle left, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise left, Charles Schwab left, Palantir left, Chevron left. Tesla moved to Texas. SpaceX moved to Texas. Over 200 companies have fled California since 2019, more than any other state in the country. And every company that leaves takes its payroll taxes, its property tax contributions, its ecosystem of employees and contractors and lunch spots and dry cleaners with it. The Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research describes it bluntly. California is hemorrhaging residents to neighboring states. That's not a think tank opinion. That is what the data shows. Here's where it gets interesting, because you might think, well, California still has a massive economy. It still has Silicon Valley, still has Hollywood. Technically, yes, but the fiscal picture underneath that economy is genuinely alarming. The state has faced budget deficits for 3 consecutive years. In 2023 to 24, a $27 billion deficit. In 2024 to 25, a $55 billion deficit. In 2025 to 26, a $12 billion shortfall patched together through internal borrowing, rating reserves, and suspending tax credits. Now, the Legislative Analyst's Office is projecting an $18 billion deficit in 2026 to 27. And here's the brutal part. They're warning that structural deficits could reach $35 billion per year by 2027 to 28. Structural, meaning baked in, meaning it doesn't go away when the stock market has a good quarter. California's budget has become almost completely dependent on taxing the capital gains and income of a relatively tiny group of wealthy earners. In the 2025 to 26 budget, personal income tax made up nearly 70% of general fund revenue. 70%. The national average is 38%. So when those high earners leave, which we've already established they are doing, the fiscal floor caves. In 2022, California had a $97 billion surplus. By 2024, a projected $56 billion deficit. That is a $175 billion swing in 2 years. Not a normal budget fluctuation, a structural problem hiding behind a boom. Let's talk about housing, because nothing explains California's collapse quite like its housing crisis. A full-time worker in California needs to earn $49.61 an hour just to afford the average fair market 2-bedroom rental without spending more than 30% of income on housing. That is the housing wage, nearly $50 an hour. For a 2-bedroom apartment, 60% of California's zip codes are unaffordable to households earning 80% of the area median income. 80%. Not poverty-level workers, median workers. Between January 2020 and September 2025, monthly mortgage payments on mid-tier homes jumped 74%. Wages grew 25% over the same period. The math doesn't work. It literally does not work. Only 23% of California households today could qualify for a mortgage on a median-priced home, down from 35% in 2019. That means more than 3 out of 4 Californians cannot afford to buy a home in the state they live in. The Public Policy Institute of California found that roughly 34% of Californians have considered moving to another state specifically because of housing costs. 1 in 3 residents is actively thinking about leaving. They're not just thinking about it either. 216,000 left last year, 240,000 the year before that. And underneath the housing crisis sits the homelessness crisis, which California has spent billions trying to solve and has made embarrassingly little progress on. Even with a reported 9% drop in unsheltered homelessness in 2025, which the governor was quick to tout, California still accounts for 28% of the nation's entire homeless population. Let that number sit for a second. California has about 11% of the U.S. population. It has 28% of the nation's homeless. That ratio does not reflect a state that is managing this well. It reflects a state where housing has become so structurally inaccessible that homelessness isn't a social anomaly. It's an almost inevitable outcome for anyone without significant economic resources and a safety net. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition found that 76% of California's extremely low-income households are severely cost-burdened, spending more than half their income on rent, half, every month. That is not a crisis at the margins. That is a system that has failed the people it was supposed to protect. So what actually explains all of this? Not one thing. Never one thing, but the pattern is clear. California has world-class talent, world-class geography, and world-class ambition. It also has regulations that make building housing functionally impossible without years and millions in approvals. It has a tax structure so dependent on the wealthy that a stock market correction doesn't just trim the budget, it detonates it. It has let remote work hollow out the commercial cores of its greatest cities while refusing for years to rezone or repurpose those empty buildings. It has watched company after company relocate to Texas and Florida and Tennessee while insisting the exodus is exaggerated. It has treated housing as a neighborhood-by-neighborhood political battle rather than a regional infrastructure emergency. The Van Ness corridor has a 53% vacancy rate in part because zoning rules make it illegal to convert certain retail spaces without years of approvals. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual mechanism. Here's the honest reality. California is not dying. Let's be fair about that. The AI boom is genuinely reshaping San Francisco. There are real signs of commercial recovery. There are 40 AI companies currently in the market searching for office space in the city, and CBRE projects that demand could cut the vacancy rate from 35% to under 18% by 2030. Downtown foot traffic in San Francisco was up nearly 22% year over year in 2025. The state still has the world's most concentrated AI ecosystem, and that matters enormously. But none of that growth fixes the fundamental problem. None of it makes housing affordable for the nurse or the teacher or the construction worker. None of it stops the population drain among working-age, working-class Californians who simply cannot afford to stay. The AI boom is creating a two-tier California, one tier of highly compensated tech workers who can afford the rents and the mortgages, and another tier of everyone else who increasingly cannot. That is not a foundation for a healthy state. That is a foundation for deepening inequality, accelerating exodus, and a tax base that remains one stock market correction away from another fiscal emergency. California has a choice. It can keep running deficits, keep watching companies relocate, keep watching its middle class hollow out, keep having the same housing conversation it's been having for 15 years, and call it resilience. Or it can build more housing, aggressively, regionally, at scale, fix the zoning rules that make vacant storefronts more financially rational than occupied ones, broaden its tax base so it doesn't collapse every time the Nasdaq pulls back, and actually invest in the infrastructure needed to retain the people it's already spent decades training and attracting. The talent is still here. The geography is still extraordinary. The innovation culture is real, but talent leaves when it can't afford rent. Businesses leave when regulation costs more than operation. People leave when the promise of California costs more than it delivers. 6 years at the bottom of the U-Haul rankings isn't a blip. It's a verdict. The question is whether anyone in Sacramento is willing to read it.